So big question number one of suffering. Um, I'll explain really what we're hoping to do. I'm going to give a talk for a little while. I've sort of split my talk in two because in the middle of my talk, we're going to hear from a couple of the church family, their own reflections on some of the teaching that the Bible gives about suffering. And then I'm going to finish my talk, and then we'll have a chance for open questions. And the questions don't just need to be answered by me. I will seek to answer them, but we can discuss and we can see where we get to really in the next hour on this big topic. So I'm going to begin, and I'm going to begin with a story. So I'm going to share my screen because I've put a PowerPoint together for this. So I'm going to share my screen, and you can have a look while we go. So we're going to start by imagine two neighboring houses with families living in those houses, families that get on really well with one another. They really like each other. They spend a lot of time together. They're good friends. One of the families is full of Christians, and the other family is full of atheists. So everybody in one house believes in Jesus Christ and follows him, and everybody in the other house doesn't really even think that there is a God. So they're good friends, these two families. But over time, both families suffer an awful tragedy. So in both families, one of their children gets an illness and dies. So both families go through this terrible tragedy at the same time. Now, the question you want to ask yourself in these neighbouring houses, is the pain and sorrow the same intensity in both households? Well, I reckon absolutely yes. The intensity of the pain and sorrow would be the same in whichever of these houses that you lived in. And would both households, would they not be asking the same anguished question of why? Well, I think again, of course, they will. I think both households will ask that question. So, does having faith in Jesus Christ or not having faith in Jesus Christ, does it really make any difference at all? Since the people face the same pain, and since they ask the same questions. Well, before we answer that, here's another couple of questions that I think would probably be asked in both of these households during this time. I reckon because they're friends and they understand each other, I reckon probably in both households this question's asked: how could a person believe in Jesus Christ in such awful circumstances? But I also think this other question will be asked: how can a person cope with such awful circumstances without Jesus Christ? I think both of those questions will be asked in both of these households during such suffering. Well, there's our story. There's our scenario, and we're going to come back to that story, that scenario later. But what I want to do now is to set out as clearly and concisely as possible the Bible's teaching on suffering. I don't want to defend it. I don't want to try to really explain it even too much yet. I just want you to have the data. I want you to have the kind of cold, hard facts so that you can interact with them. And I sent these cold, hard facts to a couple of people in our church family yesterday, and I've asked them to respond honestly to them this evening. So I want you to get their genuine, honest response to these core Bible truths. But once we've done that, then I want to show you that these facts, they're not cold and hard at all. When you consider that God himself suffered on our behalf, Jesus Christ played by his own rules, Jesus Christ triumphed to ensure that suffering isn't just random or isn't just meaningless pain. And then after that, then we will finish with the scenario we've started with. We're going to go back to that story, and we're going to consider those questions again before we open this session up to the questions that maybe you want to ask. So the data, the biblical data, I won't cover it all. There's other answers that the Bible gives to suffering as well. But here's some of the main ones that I'm going to present to you now. First of all, where does suffering come from? Well, the Bible teaches that suffering wasn't there in the beginning. And when God made this world, there wasn't suffering. But that a thing called sin changed everything. So sin, or breaking God's law, or turning away from God, there's different ways of thinking about sin. But sin, doing our own thing rather than going God's way, it's both like a sickness that breaks the world, it poisons the world. So you look around the world and you see wars and selfishness and power struggles everywhere, suffering caused by the poison of sin. But sin, as well as being a poison, sin also brings God's judgment. So sin also brings a curse from God. Now this, as I said, this cold hard data, but this is the data that the Bible gives us. So the Bible teaches that God kind of gives people over. He allows them to get on with sin. He allows them to get on with rebellion and suffering its consequences. The Bible teaches that God does restrain evil, but he doesn't stop it. So things would actually be far worse than they are without God's mercy, without God's goodness, and without God's restraint. But because sin is both a poison and brings judgment, the world just doesn't work the way we think it should. And bad things happen to seemingly good people. Good things happen to seemingly bad people, because this world is both poisoned and judged. So that's the first bit of hard, cold data for you to interact with. But secondly, does God kind of leave us on our own in suffering? Does he just leave us to it? Well, he could. He doesn't need us. The triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, he doesn't need us for anything, and he doesn't owe us anything. But actually, the incredible answer that the Bible gives to this question is that no, God does not abandon us, but in a very special way, God is with his people when they suffer. But that brings us on to this next one. Well, if that's the case, if God is actually with us in our suffering, perhaps suffering has got out of his control, because there's so much of it, isn't there? As you look around, this world is full of it. Maybe if suffering's out of God's control, maybe that explains why a good God could allow a child to die of cancer. But the Bible says no. Suffering is not out of God's control. God is on the throne of the universe. And God is sovereign. God is in control. And God is good. The Bible teaches that God is working all of his purposes out at all times. And in a really special place in the Bible for Christians, a passage that Paul wrote in Romans 8, we read that God works all things for the good of those who love him. So if suffering is not out of God's control, and if he's on the throne, and if he is working all things for the good, what might he be doing in suffering? Well, there's a lot of information on that page. And again, I'm not going to try and explain these or defend these. I'm just going to set them out for you to try to deal with. As you go along, if you've got questions relating to these, write them down or put them in the chat. We can do that later if you know how to use the chat. If not, I'll explain that to you later. But here you go. Here are some of the ways that a good God who's in control, how the Bible teaches that he uses suffering. So suffering forces people to go to Jesus. And when we suffer and we go to him for comfort, we find that our love for him grows. So suffering drives us to Christ, but also grows us in love for Jesus. Suffering grows us in our dependence upon God rather than our dependence upon ourselves. So as I said about sin, there's different ways of explaining sin, but one way is just we want to live independently of God. We want to go our own way. And actually when we suffer, it pushes us back the other way, or it can push us back the other way. Anyway, God uses it to do that. Suffering helps us to hate sin. Now, it's easy to hate sin when it does really bad things to the people around you or to you. It's harder to hate sin whenever it's doing things you like to do, even if it hurts others or dishonors God. But when you suffer, you begin to realize that sin's a horrible thing. It's a thing to be avoided. It's a thing to be stayed away from. And the more that you begin to hate sin, the more that you long to go home. Suffering helps you to want to go to God. The Bible has different names. People use different names: heaven, the new creation, paradise, whatever. But suffering helps people to want to go home. They long to go home. They realize this world isn't quite the home that they thought it should be. Suffering also brings a closer unity in the church. So the Bible teaches that the church is the family of God. He loves the church. Jesus died to make the church. And so suffering brings closer unity between God's people. So when they suffer, they are pushed together, they are forced to depend upon God together, and it does something really good within the church. Suffering, the Bible teaches, God uses it to shape our character. So we are changed when we suffer. Now, I'm not trying to explain it or defend it, but even from your experience, if you've met somebody who has suffered a lot, their character has been changed by it, and very often for the good. Suffering is used by God to shape our character so that we're more and more loving, like Him, but also so that we're more and more useful. And we'll come back to that later on as well. And then suffering tests our faith. It tests our faith and it grows us in confidence in God. When you suffer, and then you realize that actually you're still trusting God, you're still trusting God, you're still trusting God. That's what suffering does. It helps God's people to grow in confidence in God. So, back to that question, is suffering out of God's control? Well, whether those explanations satisfy you or not, the answer is no. God is using suffering to accomplish things in a poisoned world and in a judged world that cannot be accomplished in comfort. So there's things that can't be accomplished in times of comfort in this broken world that can only be accomplished during times of suffering. Well, this brings us on to a question that you have to shout out, you have to ask then. You have to say, well, hold on a minute. Is there an end to suffering? There must be an end to suffering. It can't go on and on and on. And the Bible is very, very clear about this. Yes, the whole of history is moving towards a day when all wrong will be dealt with forever. A day when there will be a final separation between good and evil. Now, this day will be a terrible one for people who reject Jesus, who haven't had their sins forgiven, and who live as if they don't need Him. They live independently of Him. But this day will be an amazing day for people who love God and who are part of His family. And so the Bible gives a number of explanations of what that day is going to be like. I'm just going to read two of them now, which are quite close to one another. It's the last book of the Bible. So Revelation 21, there's a guy, John, who spent time with Jesus, and John gets to see this amazing picture. God gives him this picture of what the future is going to be when suffering's at an end, and this is what John writes down for us. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." So there's some description of the day that will come whenever suffering will end. And here's another little bit of that as well. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face. So you can see they're visions, and so that's John trying to describe something that's indescribable, really. But you can see that both the poison of sin is being dealt with, the healing of the nations, and the judgment of sin, the curse on the world, is taken away. There is an end to suffering. The whole of history is moving towards this day. Suffering actually ends with a new beginning. This new beginning of this eternity in God's presence for God's people, enjoying all of his goodness without any little spot or flaw that can poison or that requires judgment. So there is an end to suffering. So let me just sum those cold facts. I don't think they're that cold, but let me just sum that data up. Now, the Bible says other things as well, but I think these are the key things to help us answer this question tonight. So where does suffering come from? Well, the Bible gives an explanation that suffering is a result of sin. So this is a poisoned world and it's a judged world. Are we alone in suffering? Well, the Bible teaches very clearly that in suffering, God is always with his children. Even though he owes us nothing, and even though he doesn't need us, he's with us in suffering. He's with his children anyway in suffering. Is our suffering outside of God's control? Well, no, in suffering, God is in total control and he's working for the good of his children. So I saw a really excellent sermon. I listened to a really excellent sermon on Sunday night where the pastor explained that he gave a picture of a bit of steel that is given to a blacksmith, and the blacksmith puts it in the fire, and then he puts the steel in the ice, and then he hammers and hammers and hammers the steel, and then he grinds the steel, and all of that hammering and banging and burning and freezing, all of that finally produces a beautiful result of this beautiful sword that is both beautiful and useful. And so suffering not outside of God's control, but being used by God to produce something very useful and something very beautiful. So God is testing the faith of his children, and he's changing them to be more like Jesus during suffering. And then, is there an end point to suffering? Well, yes, there's a day coming when God himself will wipe the tears away from his people. A day coming when Jesus will return to bring his children home. So leaving that slide there just for a moment while I explain what we're going to do now. That's called doctrine, or that's called the main teaching that the Bible gives on suffering. And so I sent that to a couple of people in the church family, and I just asked them to reflect on it, and then to tell me something about that maybe encourages them in their suffering, but also then maybe what other questions this brings up, or how those points are actually hard for them as they go through suffering. So these are Christians, they're both Christians, they both trust in Jesus Christ. But what I want you to see is that this teaching the Bible brings comfort, but also it still leaves us with some questions. So Chris, I'll start with you, if that's okay. I'm going to stop this. So Chris, you need to unmute your screen if you can do that. Thanks, Chris. Yeah. And so every human suffers, everybody goes through difficulties and trials. But tell us maybe, if you're willing to, just a little bit of what sort of suffering you've been going through, and then after that, what of those points kind of encourage you? We'll start with that.
So the suffering that I've been going through for the past 4 years, on and off, is, well, yeah, anxiety. So for me, mainly it's catastrophizing. So, preempting what's going to happen, but in a negative way. And just quickly in a situation, going 100 miles an hour and back, and before I know it, well, yeah, my house has fallen down, someone's died, all these kind of things. But not just the kind of psychological, kind of suffering, but the physical side of it, which is almost really crippling and disabling. When it gets you kind of tip to toe, that anxiety, the tingling, the heart rate, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's why.
Yeah, and as your friends and as people who love you, we would just love to God to click his fingers, and to take it away. But he hasn't done that yet, has he? So,
Yet, not yet.
Yeah, he has done it. Yeah, exactly. But what about those points then? Are there any of those points that do encourage you, or have particularly encouraged you?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, well, I was umming and ahhing over a couple of the points because they're all relevant in different ways. But yeah, God is always in control, I guess. Working for the good of his children probably resonates, because when I look, when I analyse the million and one things that I did worry about, well, either A, they didn't happen, or B, they worked out and they took the right course in the end. And there was certainly prayers answered in every situation. So, yeah, yeah.
Great.
And I think I guess that's then the challenge. The next step for me into, it's like, well, again, I might be quoting wrong, but I read a book, and I think it quoted Alistair Begg saying, well, if you're worrying about something, you're doubting if God got it right, and if you're anxious about something, you're doubting if God's going to get it right. And that's the challenge, really.
Yeah, because there's still questions, isn't there? So, in terms of cold hard data, it still leaves you with questions, doesn't it? I mean, are there any particular questions that you do ask as you go through this?
Yeah, okay. I mean, my pattern of each day is I start anxious and it kind of lifts, and then this time of night I feel great. And why was I worrying this morning? That's my kind of pattern. So I guess in the morning, yeah, it's like, when are you going to take this away?
Yeah.
But maybe I'm asking the wrong question. Maybe it's not when are you going to take this away, or more to the point, it's maybe what I should be asking myself is, when am I going to trust God 100%? That, I guess that's how I need to figure that out. But
Absolutely. No, that's really helpful. We might come back to that later, Chris, at the end. But that's really helpful. Thank you. There is, yeah, this doctrine brings comfort, but it also leaves us with questions we don't really fully understand, do we? But yeah, we might come back to you later then. I'm going to go to Heather now. Thanks, Chris, for that. I really appreciate you sharing that. So Heather, you've been going through mourning after losing Melvin, and that's been very tough for you. But you've been very open as you've walked through it with us as a church family. And so, same questions to you, really, in terms of, what encourages you, or what bits of that doctrine really does resonate with you and encourage you, and then which ones particularly leave you with questions?
Well, the bit about the broken world, absolutely, yes. It's very broken, and death is really horrible because it breaks relationships. So that resonates. Is God always with his children? Yes, I believe that. I know from the Bible, and I know from my experience, I've been a Christian a long time, that he is. So therefore, he's not going to stop being now. So I know he's with me. And I've seen it in other people's lives as well. Is he in total control? Yes, I believe that. But then that brings up the questions of why. I do not understand. Melvin was only 66, relatively young, just retired 15 months. Why? Why take him then? Why take him? Why not me? He was very useful. What's it all about? And I really don't understand. So that's where I've had to trust. I'm still working on that.
And I love the way you're working on it honestly. So even both Chris and yourself, just sharing these things honestly, is very, very helpful. It helps me as a pastor to look after other people better, but also it helps us as a church family to see that even though we trust God, it's tough when we can't see him and we can't see his plans. It is tough. So I'll leave it there for the time being. And again, maybe we'll come back at the end, depending on time and so on, to hear a little bit more about those, how we answer those, or how we keep wrestling with those. But I really appreciate that, and I just want us to see that these teachings that the Bible sets out, there is satisfying answers, like intellectually, but that sometimes is another matter of being satisfied emotionally, isn't it? And so we'll maybe get there in this next section a little bit more, because what I want to do now is I want to take those kind of cold hard facts and I want to kind of make them a bit warmer, because I want us to think about Jesus, who is the greatest demonstration, really, of the fact that God does accomplish good, even in hard suffering. So let me just put the slide back up. There we go. Right. So what I've tried to explain so far is that God has good purposes in suffering. And now that's a very hard thing to hear when you're suffering, but God has good purposes. So what did Jesus accomplish by suffering? The Bible teaches that Jesus is God in flesh, who came to this earth to do something about our problem of sin and everything that flows from it, all the suffering that flows from it. So what did Jesus accomplish by suffering? Well, all through his life and then his passion, the lead up to him going to the cross, he faced all the same struggles and stresses as we did. And yet the Bible teaches very clearly that he was righteous all the time. He never sinned. He never became part of the problem. He lived, he struggled, he was tempted, he faced pressures and stress and opposition and people who didn't like him, and death and people, his friends dying. He faced all of these things, and yet he always lived the way that God revealed that his people should live, okay, through his law. So Jesus, the Bible calls this righteousness, but just complete goodness all the time. And what that accomplished, the good that came out of that life of suffering and struggle, was that this righteousness, this goodness, God credits it to the people who follow Jesus. He gives it as a gift to those who follow Jesus, who are kind of linked to Jesus and connected to Jesus through faith. So through his life, a huge amount was accomplished, a life of struggle. But then through his crucifixion, as he was dying on the cross, he was suffering as the only ever innocent one to suffer. And so he paid fully for sin to the last drop. That's what the Bible teaches happened at the cross. And so what did that accomplish? Well, those who belong to him again, those who are connected to him, with him through faith, they have all of their sins washed away forever. So the sins that poisoned this world, the sins that brought God's judgment upon this world, they are washed away for Jesus's followers through the most deepest suffering imaginable that Jesus willingly took on. And then his death and resurrection. So he died and he was buried, but he rose again. That is the central tenet of our faith as Christians. What did that accomplish? Well, death itself was defeated. Death couldn't keep its hold on Jesus. And so death itself was defeated for, again, all of those who are followers of Jesus, connected to him. And also God's judgment on sin, his justice, which we're going to think about a bit more next week, justice, this longing for justice. But justice was done. Judgment was carried out. And so what did that accomplish for people who put their trust in Jesus? Well, the Bible teaches that there's no condemnation. People can look forward to seeing God and being in his presence. They can be excited about that. They are made new. They are new creations because Jesus has this new life to offer. All of those things that were accomplished as Jesus suffered at the cross. So I want to just share with you 3 very important verses, or sets of verses, that the Bible teaches to help us with this. The first one's this. The book of Hebrews says, "For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, scorning its shame. So Jesus saw suffering, and he saw how bad the suffering was going to be, but he could see beyond the suffering at the joy that that would accomplish. So it would rescue people who put their trust in him forever, for eternity. And Jesus thought, my suffering is worth it. And so his suffering accomplished our eternal joy. And this is the pattern for suffering for people who believe in Jesus, is that God does good things in it. That's the greatest example of God doing something incredible in it. But God does good things as his people suffer. The next little set of verses talk about how, because Jesus suffered, then he sympathizes with us. He understands us. He knows exactly what we're like. He knows what we're going through. And yet he can offer us what we need as we go through the darkest of times. So this talks about Jesus as a high priest, okay? A priest bridges the gap, takes you to God or whatever. But we don't have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses or sympathize. But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. So let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So Jesus understands your pain. Right now, it's not just a head knowledge of this. Jesus, to his heart, understands the pain that Heather was talking about, the pain that Chris was talking about, your pain. He understands it. He sympathizes, and he says, come and get help in your time of need. And then this is some of my favorite verses of the whole Bible. Jesus just finished telling people off and telling them that they're in serious trouble for rejecting him. And then he says to other people, he says to people who are really needy, he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You see, in suffering, we often put God in the wrong place in the courtroom. So we often put God on the other side of the courtroom, and we kind of throw accusing questions at him. Even if we haven't believed in him up until this point, we put him over there and we throw accusing questions at him as if he's on the other side of the courtroom. And the stark reality is that he could throw us in the dock and he could simply condemn us forever. But Jesus instead offers struggling sufferers, he invites them that he could be on their side of the courtroom. He could be there with us in our suffering against the sin that has left us there helpless, this poisoning sin, this sin that brings judgment. Jesus offers to be on our side of the courtroom. So in our suffering, we are to come to him, and we're to accept his yoke, or we're to treat him as our king. We're to follow him, but he won't ever let us down. So I want to, with that said, I hope that this brings warmth to the kind of data, the doctrine, the teaching. Jesus he's the only one that really can bring warmth to that, but he does. But I want to just go back to where we started, this scenario, this story that we started with. Two families dealing with acute suffering. Do they face the same pain? Yes, absolutely. Do they have the same questions? Yes, mostly. So do they share the same mourning? No. And this is where the difference is suddenly very real. So listen to these words from the Bible as Paul seeks to help a church family who are in the middle of suffering. And he says this, he says, we are not to mourn as those who have no hope. So Christians, God's people, are to mourn, but we are not to mourn as those who have no hope. It is hope that makes the difference. It is hope that changes suffering. It is still the same pain, and we still have the same questions, but people who know that Jesus Christ both suffered and triumphed can have hope even in the middle of the deepest of all sufferings. So go back to those two questions that I finished the scenario with. These two families, surely they must be thinking, how can a person maintain faith in Jesus Christ in such suffering? Well, faith in Jesus Christ is the only thing that can bring hope, both for now, enough to get through today. So as Chris wakes up in the morning, enough to get through today, but also hope for later, certain hope that means when everything is made new, when Jesus returns, when God makes everything new and perfect, certain hope that we will be part of that for eternity. That's that question. How can a person maintain faith in Jesus Christ? Because it's the only thing that can bring hope. What about how can a person cope without faith in Jesus Christ? Well, that's a question I ponder. And I'll be honest, I don't know the answer because I am quite a resilient person. But I haven't even suffered that much. I've tasted the suffering of the church family around me. But even then, my own well runs dry. You know, my resources are so little. Even though I'm quite a resilient person, my own resources run very dry, even without the acute suffering that the families in this scenario are experiencing. So I urge you, and I urge you to urge the people around you to put their faith in Jesus, because there is actually no other answer, and there is no other lasting hope in the middle of the suffering that everybody has to go through. So there we go. There's where we've started with a story. We've set some data out for us that the Bible teaches. We've heard from a couple of the members of the church family, and we've returned to this story. But what I would want to do now really is to just open it up now to a few more comments or questions that will help us to get a bit more deeper into this, and then once we've done that, we'll finish up after that. So you can type your question in the chat if you want, or you can just ask your question, and we'll see what we can do with it, or we'll see what other comments that people have with it. So does anybody have a comment or a question that would like to start things off with? Go on then, Phil.
Right. When Jesus suffered, it was for a purpose, and we can understand that. And that's the number one thing, isn't it? Sometimes we suffer and we don't understand why. And that's a really hard thing. It's like Heather's example.
Yeah.
That's the hard thing to do with when you don't understand why you're going through such an experience.
Absolutely. I've got stuff to say to that, but I just wonder, does anybody want to join in with that? Or does anybody want to say anything more about that before I do?
Okay.
I guess
Go on then, Chris.
Let me give you an example.
Oh, let Phil give an example, and then we'll come to you, Chris. Good.
Right, who's talking?
You go, Phil. You go.
I'll give you an example from my own life. I mean, most of you know that I lost a limb in an accident. That was 20 years ago. But at the time, and I was a Christian, and I had been a Christian for a long time, I couldn't understand why God had let that happen to me. And I was quite bitter and angry about it. But over a period of time, I think God showed me that if I'd carried on working under the stress that I was working under at the time, I would probably have had a heart attack and died. So it enabled me to understand and cope with what happened. Mm-hmm. And it set me off. I had to retire from work. It set me off in a complete new direction. And it's brought me a lot closer to God in ways that I never expected.
That's very interesting. That's very helpful, Phil. Yeah, you're a very capable guy, but I guess it's very interesting, isn't it, that maybe you don't know. I don't know. You don't know all the answers, but you maybe without that as well. Maybe that was in terms of dependence upon God. I think you do depend upon God a lot, but I think maybe that's part of the story as well. That dependence upon God, that maybe you wouldn't have had to feel the same need. I don't know, but that's very helpful. Thank you, Chris. What were you going to say? Because
I guess the why question. I guess we have to something that only recently I've kind of kind of been hearing, and is that we might not get that answered, and we have to remember who's at the top of the tree here. It is God, not us, and He ultimately, whether we like it or not, has the right to do what He wants, and we don't always know why, and we maybe never will know why.
Yeah.
And I guess it's okay to accept that.
That's really helpful as well.
No,
I really like you've said that we might never know why. So, I liked what Phil said there, that he can look back and say, "Oh, here maybe some of the reasons," but maybe we might not know is right. One of the things I was going to say to that, and I'm going to put this in the chat. I'm going to put a couple of resources that people can. And if you know how to use the chat, you could probably click on the chat. I don't know, is it even there? Have we enabled chat? There you go, co-host. See if we've enabled chat. Because I would quite like to. Oh, there is a chat there. So I'll put, after I've said this, there's a little devotion from Corrie ten Boom that we looked at in our staff team last week. And Corrie ten Boom and her sister suffered hugely in a concentration camp. And actually her sister Betsy died, and Corrie survived it. But in this devotion now, I'll put it on, and you can save it to your own computer and read it later. But suffered incredible, terrible things, really. But as I read the devotion and I thought about it afterwards, at the time they wouldn't have had any clue at all the significance of their suffering. It wouldn't have felt significant. It would have felt they were just one of thousands of people being treated absolutely terribly during the Holocaust. But hundreds of thousands of people Christians ever since, have been encouraged by their suffering, by what God did with them in their suffering. It wouldn't have felt significant. It didn't feel significant, I'm sure. I'm sure it just felt absolutely appalling most of the time. And yet what God did with it is very surprising, and just very amazing, really. And so I will put that, just a little devotion, but maybe some of you have read of Corrie ten Boom before, and the ten Boom family. But it's just another example of we can't understand often at the time. And as Chris says, we maybe never will understand what our suffering has been about. But God isn't making any mistakes as we suffer. And so there is this trust that can go with it. But that is easier to write down on paper than it is to feel when you're going through suffering. However, I'd still prefer to have that God to ask questions of, and that good God who came to the cross for me to wrestle with, rather than just thinking it's totally random and totally pointless and totally meaningless, which it has to be if there is no God, if there is no meaning, if there is no purpose. And I think that's, it's hard, but that's where I'm glad I'm on that, having those wrestles.
Thinking of a practical scenario, one of the ladies that I spoke to on door to door, basically, if I remember rightly, she'd lost a husband, a son, and a brother or sister, one of them. Obviously quite bitter about it, and was basically saying that she wasn't interested in a God that would allow that to happen. How then would we, if I ever got to speak to her again, would we deal with a situation like that?
Does anybody else want to chip in with that before I do?
Yeah, Alison's.
Oh, I was just going to say, this seems like similar conversations I've had with my family, and I think if they don't know God, they think suffering is so unfair because they feel like they don't deserve to suffer. But it wants, and again, from my own perspective, now I know God, that I know that actually I do deserve to suffer. And actually, by God's grace, I'm not suffering more than I am because we deserve to. And I think if you don't know Genesis, it's really hard to answer that question, because Genesis reveals that actually God is good and everything that he made in the beginning was good until sin entered. And that is the result of all the suffering, the natural world, human life. And I think without starting there, it's really hard to try and sum it up. But that's what I found helpful, to go right to the beginning and found out why we're not suffering more.
Yeah, I mean again, Alison, that's kind of data, isn't it? That when people hear that, that is provokes a response, but it's absolutely right. That's the what has sin done? It's poisoned and it's brought God's judgment. That there's an explanation there, and if that is the explanation, then the next question is there a solution? And if there's no explanation, there's no solution, is there? But if there is an explanation, the solution is to do with being right with God rather than being wrong with God, isn't it? I mean, it would be hard on the doors. It'd be hard just meeting somebody to press that point, because you'd want them to understand how much you feel for their suffering and how you understand it. But ultimately, that's right. The fact that there is an explanation for why we suffer, as well as a solution, not just a temporary solution, but a permanent solution to suffering, it's got to be what we talk about. I agree. We don't think sin. I think part of the problem is we don't realize how bad sin is. We think it's just these small things that people do wrong, but it has poisoned the world. It has brought God's judgment, and then Jesus had to go to the cross for both of those things to be sorted out. So, yeah, and none of us feel that we deserve to suffer. We don't feel it, do we? We don't feel like we deserve any suffering.
And it's interesting when you read like the Open Doors stuff, because in the countries where Christians are persecuted, they often see it as an honour to suffer, like they are worthy of suffering, and they have a really different approach to suffering, which is quite interesting, really. I was asking myself this question when I was reading the prayer diary: do I count myself worthy enough to suffer? Like they say, as an honour to suffer for God, for the name of Jesus. And that, I suppose that's a whole other thing, but it does make it's a different perspective completely on suffering.
Although it still wouldn't feel good, would it? I mean, this is the thing as well. This is why it's so hard. This is why suffering's so hard, is because it still doesn't. It's still the same pain, isn't it? So if you're in a country being persecuted at the minute for your faith in Jesus Christ, the actual pain, or if you've been put in jail, the separation from your family, or all of that stuff is still horrific, isn't it? It's still awful. But you're right about, again, perspective, about being able to see, yeah, well, like Jesus suffered, he understands. And so for a Christian, there is, about being associated with Jesus in suffering, there is something that's incredible about that. But not, we don't say that lightly. We don't pretend that the suffering itself isn't. But I agree, again, I agree. But these are hard truths, aren't they? Because they're not normal truths that people will engage with. These are hard truths. Yeah, thank you. I have a question for you, just to ponder yourself then. So, the people that you know who have suffered a lot, compared to the people maybe that haven't suffered very much, my question for you is just, do you notice a difference in their character? Nobody has to answer this out loud, but I would love you to think about it. Do you notice a difference in their character? Do you notice a difference in how they deal with the normal grind of life? I'll give you an example. I was in hospital visiting a few different people last week, and one of the ladies in church who's been in hospital, and her sister was there, and she began to tell me about her life, and in a very non-complaining way, she explained lots of the different struggles that she has had. I don't think her intention was to put the focus on herself, but she was just going through not being able to have kids, and then kids that have all or kids and grandkids with all sorts of different issues and difficulties and struggles. And so she told me this for a while, and I was talking, and then she said about her and her sister, who was in hospital at the time. She said, God's just been so good to us. We've been so lucky. She said lucky, but they said God's been so good to us. And I thought, wow, like, you've just told me about all these things that would have most people shaking their fist at God on the far side of the courtroom, and then in your next breath you're saying God's just been so good to you and he's looked after you. So again, that's my question for you and anybody who listens to this, if it's sent to them after this time, is to take note of the Christians that you know who have suffered, and then see if this isn't right. See if God doesn't do good things in people's life through suffering. And then whoever sent you this video, or whoever Christian you know, ask them some more questions about that. Well, if we do not have any more questions, then I'm going to leave it there. We're going to come back and do our session next week is on justice. So part of suffering in this world is realizing that people get away with stuff, realizing that the wrong do prosper, okay, the evil often prosper, and the good seem to suffer, as Alison's been talking about, even the persecuted church around the world. And we long for justice. We absolutely hate it when people have got away with something. And we hate it even more whenever they've got away with hurting us and nobody has done anything about it. We long for justice, real justice. So what does the Bible have to say about that? And how does Jesus, again, coming back to Jesus, how does Jesus answer the question of justice? So I'd love you to send this video when it comes out to your friends, and I'd love you to come back next week. I'd love you to invite others to come back next week. And we'll follow the same rough trajectory next week as well. Again, we'll see where we get to, but we'll follow the same rough trajectory. We'll hear from some people in the church family. We'll have a time for questions. We'll do our very best to answer them as best as the Bible allows us to answer them. So thank you so much for coming, and I will see you all soon, and hopefully see you next week.